Good day. The big news from the Ukrainian front over the last 24 hours, at least as far as the Russians are concerned, are reports which have come from a place called Mercouris on the northeastern part of the front lines that a Ukrainian military unit, a unit I should say of the regular Ukrainian army, supposedly carried out executions, extrajudicial killings of 11 Russian prisoners of war. Now, there's video evidence of this event, but of course, as is always the case, it's very difficult for a detached observer like myself, far away in London, to give an objective assessment of it and to say exactly what took place. The Russians, of course, are quite clear that this was the murder of their soldiers by Ukraine, by a regular unit of the Ukrainian army. As far as I'm aware, the Ukrainians deny this, and I'm not going to say what I think happened. I'm not going to speculate as to what happened. I've discussed these stories, these atrocity stories that take place in this war. They take place, by the way, in every war, but this particular war has produced a particularly gruesome crop of them. And what I invariably and always say is that they require investigation, independent investigation by the kind of independent, impartial agencies that once existed. And this particular murder, if it is a murder, alleged murder of Russian prisoners of war, is just one example. I have to say straight away that I don't expect any such independent investigation to take place, and I'm afraid that, like all of these allegations which have been made throughout this war of atrocities, I'm afraid this one will remain, as all the others have been, unresolved and undecided. So that's what I'm going to say about this incident, except to say that, of course, it has been widely circulated and broadcast in Russia, and of course it has hardened feelings there, as these events, these episodes invariably do. Now, what has been going on in Ukraine, apart from this particularly gruesome incident, which, as I said, I'm not going to say more about? Well, again, one could talk about stability on the front lines. It seems to me that at the moment there are basically three sieges taking place in eastern Ukraine. One in the south is a Russian siege of the Ukrainian forces in Ugleda. The next is the gradual breaking by the Russians of the long-standing Ukrainian siege of Donetsk city. And here it seems that the Russians have made some more progress over the last few hours. They've apparently cleared a settlement called Opytnoe, which is close to Avdiivka, which is one of the the centerpiece of the Ukrainian forces that have been besieging Donetsk, shelling Donetsk, ever since the fighting began. The fighting in Ukraine began in 2014. Now, I would say there are two places in Ukraine called Opytnoe, or at least in eastern Ukraine called Opytnoe, which have been part of the battles. One is a place near Bakhmut, and the other is this place that I'm talking about near Donetsk. Now, I believe and I understand that this place that the Russians have now captured, the Wagner Group has now captured, is in fact the Opytnoe near Donetsk city, not the Wagner Group, I'm sorry, the Russians have captured, is this place, this Opytnoe near Donetsk. The Opytnoe near Bakhmut was captured by the Wagner Group back in October. So the Russians now control both of these two places called Opytnoe and the Opytnoe near Donetsk, as I said, is now under Russian control. This is my understanding of what's happening on the particular battlefields. And that brings the Russians closer, ever closer, to the final encirclement of Avdiivka and the breaking of the siege of Donetsk city, this long siege that's been going on ever since the fighting first began in 2014. And then there is, of course, more fighting going on further north. Ukraine has been trying to launch more attacks in northern Donbass. Again, all of those attacks have been repelled. And this is, by the way, as I understand it, the area where this alleged massacre of Russian prisoners of war has taken place. But again, as I said, I'm not going to discuss that in more detail. So we have sieges in Ugledar, Russian siege of Ugledar, a Ukrainian siege of Donetsk city, which is gradually, steadily, incrementally being broken, and of course the Russian siege of Bakhmut city. And there again, in Bakhmut, it's difficult to get very much detailed information at the moment. I get the impression, by the way, that one other thing that General Surovikin has done since he took control is that he's tightened up information security so that we're getting less information from the Russian side on progress in various battlefields. But what one is hearing is a very, very heavy Ukrainian losses in Bakhmut. Well, that's an old story, but it's apparently a continuing story, and of Ukrainian formations being rotated out of Bakhmut as they become severely depleted, and with the Russians slowly, gradually tightening their grip on the city, with apparently street fighting taking place now in parts of it. As I said, this is a slow grind in Bakhmut. The Ukrainians are apparently deeply committed to holding on to Bakhmut for as long as they can. And I get the sense that if you want to find a comparison with Stalingrad in this war, Bakhmut is probably the best place to find it. By the way, whilst I'm talking about battlefield developments, I think it's perhaps worth saying that fighting in Kherson region west of the Dnieper, or at least military activity in Kherson region west of the Dnieper, apparently continues. The Russian artillery forces based on the East Bank apparently regularly shell Ukrainian formations west of the Dnieper, and apparently the Russian Air Force is also active in the area west of the Dnieper, and also attacks and inflicts casualties on Ukrainian forces there. There's never been any quiet in this area, so Ukraine is still suffering losses west of the Dnieper from this Russian artillery and from these Russian airstrikes. And one gets the sense that despite the Russian withdrawal to the east bank of the Dnieper, Ukrainian control of the west bank of the Dnieper is actually rather tenuous. Of course, the area has been significantly depopulated by the Russian evacuations, and one is hearing reports that Kherson city itself is in extremely bad shape. There's no water, electricity, and apparently supplies of food are also running fairly short there. And I've seen some rather distressing pictures of conditions in Kherson city, which, however, again, are very difficult to judge. It's very difficult to say exactly what is going on there, and one always has to be careful when seeing photographs that these are not being manipulated in order to convey some purpose. So I'm not going to say much more of that. But it does seem as if there's been considerable artillery and airstrikes on the Ukrainian formations in Kherson, that they're continuing to suffer losses. And interestingly enough, it seems that the Ukrainians are now transferring, well, it's not surprising, but they're transferring most of their best troops from Kherson region, and that they're leaving territorial defense troops, that's to say, reservists, called up reservists, older reservists in Kherson, to try to control this area, which, as I said, seems to be largely depopulated, and which the Ukrainians seem to show little interest for the moment in trying to revive economically. Now, that perhaps opens the possibility one day for a Russian counteroffensive in Kherson region, but that's obviously not part of the Russian agenda at the moment. What is part of the Russian agenda for the moment, other than prosecuting these three sieges, Ugledar, the area around Donetsk, where they're actually breaking the siege, and Bakhmut, what the Russians are doing instead is that they're continuing with their energy and missile war. And one of the most interesting things that happened on the last few days is that it seems that for the first time over the course of this war, Ukrainian gas facilities, natural gas facilities, were attacked. We don't quite know exactly what was attacked, and it seems that the information, the Ukrainians, for obvious reasons, are trying to keep the information about the nature of these attacks on their gas transportation system fairly secret, but nonetheless it does seem that some kind of attacks on the energy system did take place, and it's been suggested that amongst the targets were the Shebelensky gas processing plant near Balakleya, a town that was captured by the Ukrainians back in September, in Kharkiv region, and elsewhere. So, as has been pointed out by some Russian commentators, it could be that an offensive against Ukraine's gas facilities, a missile offensive against Ukraine's gas facilities, could be in the works eventually, cutting off another source of energy for Ukraine, but also, of course, greatly complicating Europe's own energy problems, which we've discussed many times in many programs. So that's one thing that has happened. Another thing that the Russians have done is that they've launched a heavy missile strike on the Motorsic factory in Zaporizhzhia. Now, Motorsic is one of the jewels in Ukraine's industrial crown. Ukraine did inherit some enormously important strategic enterprises from the Soviet Union. There was the major tank factory, for example, in Kharkiv, which used to make for the Soviet Union its T-34 and then T-64 tanks, which were the legendary T-34 tank, which became the mainstay of the Soviet military during the Second World War, was developed. But it was also the place where, well, you could almost say the first modern Soviet tank, the T-64, was developed in the 1960s. And so there's that facility. There's the major rocket facility in Dnipro, or Dnipropetrovsk, as the Russians still call it, which was a mainstay both of the Soviet Union's intercontinental ballistic missile program, and, by the way, to some extent, of its space program as well. There was also the Antonov Design Bureau, which is located near Kiev, which accounted for a large proportion of the Soviet Union's fleet, very large fleet of transport aircraft, freight aircraft, I should say. And there was Morcouris. Morcouris is a major factory. It produces aircraft engines, including engines for helicopters. Many of the Soviet Union's helicopters had their engines made at Morcouris, including the Mil-8 helicopters, which are now very much a mainstay of both the Russian and Ukrainian air forces. The Ukrainian helicopters, the Mil-8s from Ukraine, as I understand it, most of them now are helicopters supplied by the United States, actually Mil-17s provided by the United States, which had been originally bought by the United States from Russia and intended to be used in Afghanistan. Those helicopters have now been sent to Ukraine instead. And of course, they've also been provided with some helicopters, no doubt Mil-8 helicopters, from various other friends and allies of the United States who had previously acquired them either from the Soviet Union or from Russia. And mostly, I suspect, these come from Eastern Europe. Anyway, these helicopters get repaired, their engines get repaired, their equipment gets repaired at Morcouris. And of course, Morcouris, no doubt, can also provide some servicing for some of the engines used by other Ukrainian aircraft, including possibly fighter aircraft. It has an expertise in that particular area. But Morcouris has another role, which is that, of course, it was the center of the Soviet Union's enormous gas turbine industries. Now, the Russians do make gas turbines. They make marine turbines as well for their ships. But right up until 2014, they actually sourced many of these engines from Morcouris. These were old Soviet designs, but they were still viable, and they used to buy them from Morcouris. And of course, they stopped doing so after 2014, and they've since developed their own. But gas turbines are, of course, turbines, in fact, not just gas turbines, turbines are, of course, an essential part of any energy complex. And Morcouris has, in Soviet terms, unrivaled expertise in producing turbine technology. And of course, if you're attacking the Ukrainian energy system, which is what the Russians are doing, you want to make sure that Ukraine is not able to replace any destroyed components, substitute with other components, and that, of course, makes Morcouris an interesting and important target. Now, we've had one previous attack on Morcouris. This does seem to have been the biggest up to now from the Russians. And it's been interesting because the Russians have been attacking major component parts of the military-industrial complex, the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, ever since the start of the war. But until fairly recently, they've held off from attacking Morcouris. Now, there's a lot of speculation as to why this is the case. Ukraine has basically hinted that it's because the director of the Morcouris plant was a Russian spy. And in fact, the unfortunate man has been arrested and is now in captivity in Ukraine, no doubt facing treason charges. But I think another major reason, and the reason I personally think is the most plausible, is that Morcouris did at one point in time receive a lot of Chinese investment. The Chinese are heavily invested in Morcouris. They used a lot of its technological expertise to build up their own turbine industry, which is now, by the way, the biggest in the world by far. While I won't say that the Chinese depended exclusively on Morcouris' skills, certainly in some fields like marine turbines, for example. I suspect that Mortarsic was very important indeed, and possibly for helicopter engines as well. Anyway, regardless, it's been some time since Mortarsic has played that role in the Chinese industrial world, and in fact, before the war began, there was heavy pressure on Ukraine from the United States to close off the connection between Mortarsic and China, and apparently that was successful, which I remember it was something of a major scandal in China when that happened, and Chinese investors were very angry about it. But anyway, I think that one way or the other, whatever inhibitions there probably were at one point, holding the Russians back from attacking Mortarsic have gone, and we've now had significant strikes being carried out against Mortarsic, and I suspect that these are mostly connected to the overall Russian war against the Ukrainian energy system. And as at the time of speaking, Zelensky himself says that something like 17 regions of Ukraine are severely short of power, and there's been protests against blackouts and things like that in some cities, including Odessa, by the way, and that seems to be a story of continuing breakdown of the Ukrainian energy system. By the way, I read a Ukrainian report which claimed that all that stands between Ukraine and the total collapse of its energy system are 6 surviving transformers which have not yet been destroyed by the Russians. If and when the Russians destroy those, Ukraine will be without power. I have to say straight away that I think that is an exaggeration, as one often hears, but I think that we are seeing the steady degrading of the Ukrainian energy system, and apparently Ukraine now officially says that it's up to 50% degraded. Now, I'm going to repeat my view, which is taken from John Helmer, that the Russians are, for the moment, not seeking to completely knock out Ukraine's energy system. They will do that when it is militarily in their interests to do so. In other words, when the moment comes for them to launch their great winter offensive, which everybody is expecting. It'll happen around that time. There is no point in knocking out the entire energy system now, waiting and then racing with the Ukrainians as they try to bring it back into repair. Better knock it out when your forces are moving and the Ukrainians are distracted, and it then becomes a cumulative problem for Ukraine alongside all the crisis on the battlefronts. So I with Helmer on this, I think Helmer got this. He was apparently advised about this by some specialists, and I'm sure this is the correct view of what the Russians are trying to do with the energy system at the moment. On that point, however, there's been a very interesting discussion in, I think it was the New York Times, and they've been saying, how is it? Because we've been talking about the Russians running out of missiles for months now. So how was it possible for the Russians to launch go on launching wave upon wave of missiles at Ukraine's energy system, that they were able to launch 90 missiles with devastating effects on Ukraine in one day, for example, at a time when they're supposed to have run out of missiles. And the New York Times, I think it was the New York Times, went through various possibilities that these were converted S-300 missiles. Well, that's clearly not the case. We can see, in fact, that they were the fully advanced, fully up-to-date Russian Kalibr cruise missiles and Russian KH-101 missiles, air-launched missiles. So it was clearly not old S-300s. The other possibility is that Russian reserve stocks of these missiles are bigger than was anticipated. Well, maybe they are. Who knows? The third is that the Chinese are making it for the Russians. Well, that we can completely rule out. There is no evidence of that whatsoever. And the fourth is that the Russians are building more and more cruise missiles. Well, for the record, I think it is both that the Russian reserves of missiles are far from exhausted, and secondly, that the Russians are indeed building more and more of these cruise missiles. Now, obviously, we don't know how big Russian production of cruise missiles is. That's a state secret, which only the Russians know. Interesting, by the way, that the West doesn't. But anyway, my understanding is that the Russians have well-organized production lines and that they're able to keep these missiles, they're able to produce these missiles, as they once said, they can make them like pancakes. And that, I suspect, is indeed what they're doing. Now, this article in the New York Times then queried this question. They said, how do the Russians find the microchips that these missiles need? And again, it came back to the story that the Russians have been stockpiling microchips since 2014. Well, that's possible. Maybe they have done. I'm going to make a few observations here, however. Firstly, I don't know how advanced these microchips that these subsonic missiles need use, how advanced these microchips are. I doubt that they are the most cutting edge microchips. And maybe the Russians have stockpiled microchips since 2014. It would be an obvious thing for them to have done and to do, but it seems to me much more likely that the Russians are producing their own microchips. They have just announced a major order for Zircon hypersonic missiles, anti-ship missiles, which runs into dozens. These apparently do use the more advanced microchips. I find it very difficult to believe that the Russians will have decided to develop weapon systems of this kind of sophistication and will rely on microchips, microprocessors developed by allies of the West, Korea, Taiwan, South Korea, Taiwan, to build for the use of these most important missiles that the Russians have are putting in service and which are an absolutely essential part of their military system. So I think that this legend, this fantasy of the Russians running out of microchips, having to yank microchips out of washing machines and things of that kind in order to keep their military industries whirring. I think all of this is just fantasy, actually. And I think the sooner we abandon it and look at the realities on the ground, the fact that the Russians could continue to launch these waves of missile strikes and these waves of drone attacks, well, that tells us that this is not really the problem that the West, that the United States thought it would be when it imposed all of these restrictions. And by the way, if I'm right in what I think that the Russians are able to produce to cover all their needs, their military needs with microchips, then the Chinese certainly are not going to have any problems either with their far bigger industrial capacities. Anyway, that's that's so much for that, at least. As we see, missile strikes are continuing. The missile strikes have been continuing. The energy system continues to be targeted. The Russians have now gone after the Motor-Sich factory in Zaporizhzhia, and they've also gone after some parts, some minor parts of Ukraine's gas transportation system. Now, since we're on the topic of Zaporizhzhia, there's more reports now that the Ukrainians are concentrating forces in Zaporizhzhia, perhaps in anticipation of this offensive that they intend to launch from Zaporizhzhia towards Melitopol and the Sea of Azov, the attempt to try to sever the land bridge from Russia to Crimea. Well, I've seen one report from Riba which says that the number of forces that the Ukrainians are trying to concentrate in this area number between 25 and 40,000. If that is correct, I don't think this is anywhere near enough for the kind of offensive Ukraine apparently has in mind. And there are some reports that some Ukrainian commanders are worried that an offensive of this nature, if it were ever launched, would not only fail, but would set up Ukraine for a Russian counterattack, which might lead to the capture of Zaporizhzhia city itself. If Zaporizhzhia city is captured, well, I have to say that would be by far the biggest defeat either side has suffered over the course of this war. Zaporizhzhia is a much bigger place than any of the other places that we've been talking about. Mariupol, Kherson, Bakhmut, the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation, any of these places. It is one of the big industrial cities of Ukraine and indeed of the former Soviet Union. So apparently there is some nervousness in Ukraine about this offensive. The Russians know all about this offensive. They've been building fortifications, trenches, pillboxes, you name it. And of course, they have large numbers of troops concentrated in this area. So if there is an offensive, a Ukrainian offensive, I've no doubt that they can counter it, and no doubt they would be able to go on a counteroffensive as well. It's also the sort of place, this area, which the Russians are not going to retreat from. They're not going to do what they did in Kherson region and previously in Kharkiv region and vacate the space, because I think it is too important. And they obviously want to keep the land bridge to Crimea. It is in fact essential for them to do so. And so I think that the Russians will dig in and fight and then counterattack. And I think everybody who's following this conflict can see that that is what the Russians intend to do. So there we go. That's the situation on the battlefields at the moment. That is the situation for Ukraine. It's increasingly looking to me as if this capture of Kherson city has turned for Ukraine into something of a Pyrrhic victory. It doesn't seem as if they can cross the Dnieper to the east bank. There's been some sporadic mortar attacks on Russian positions on the east bank, but the Russian artillery and the Russian Air Force are able to greatly overmatch this, and the Russians, on the contrary, are still able to inflict losses on Ukrainian forces on the west bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region. And Kherson city itself, as I've said, is in a very poor shape, and there doesn't seem to be any real will in Ukraine either to commit really strong forces to defend it or to bring it back towards any kind of economic health. And elsewhere, the Russians continue with their advances in Ugledar, in Bakhmut, and near Donetsk city. And I think that's one can really say about the situation on the battlefields at the moment. Now, yesterday I did touch upon the fact that the diplomacy, there was this flurry of interest after Sullivan's visit to Kiev earlier this month about Ukraine moderating its position with respect to diplomacy. All of that seems to have died away. There doesn't seem to be any real initiative anymore to try to bring energy to this diplomacy. Maybe some of the calculus in Washington has changed. Maybe the hardliners have won out against people like General Milley, who, by the way, did reverse himself in a press conference with General Austin, as we discussed, Alex Christoforou, Brian Boletic, and I on a live stream we did for the Duran over the course of this week, this week that's been passing. Maybe the hardliners have won through, or maybe the political imperative to seek a diplomatic solution has disappeared in Washington, with the Biden administration getting better than expected results in the midterms. Or perhaps there's just too much exhaustion altogether. There's just a feeling that people are just so tired of Ukraine that they can't really even exert themselves to the point of putting together a diplomatic initiative. So there's really no sign of this. The only diplomatic energy that continues to be is between Russia and Turkey. And I discussed yesterday the telephone call between Erdogan and Putin, and I read out the readout that the Kremlin has provided, and amongst one of the things that has happened is that there's been a decision to extend the grain deal. Now, the grain deal allows Ukrainian ships to leave Odessa and certain other Ukrainian Black Sea ports, escorted by the Turkish Navy, but they have to pass through certain particular sea channels, and if they do that, the Russians won't interfere with them. And in addition, of course, part of the original grain deal agreed back in July obliged Ukraine to demine the approaches to the port of Odessa. So the Russians have agreed with the Ukrainians to the extension of the grain deal. Now, a couple of weeks ago, when there was a Ukrainian attack, drone attack on Sevastopol, which went hideously wrong, completely failed, the Russians said that they were suspending their participation from the grain deal. And then, a few days later, it turned out that the Russians agreed to re-enter the grain deal. The Ukrainians supposedly had provided assurances that they were not going to use this sea channel to launch drone attacks on Russian military installations. They'd given written assurances to Erdogan, to Turkey, about this. There was a lot of sneering at this in the West, and lots of comments and claims that Putin and the Russians had backed down. Well, it's now clear that, in fact, as part of the renegotiation, first of Russia's re-entry into the grain deal after it suspended its participation some weeks ago, and then as part of the extension of the grain deal, the European Union has actually had to make significant concessions. It's finally agreed to unlock exports of Russian food and fertilizer that was being held up in EU ports. Now, it was part of the original grain deal, as it was negotiated back in July, that this would happen. And I remember that the EU actually said that, Russian grain and fertilizer had never been subjected to sanctions, and that they were prepared to sort of ease off certain sanctions to allow that grain and fertilizer to get the shipping and insurance services that it needed in order to be sold, to be shipped to the countries in the global south, which Russia wants to supply its grain and food and fertilizer to. Except, of course, that didn't happen. The Europeans said that they were going to unblock the transfer of Russian food and fertilizer from their ports. The weeks passed and it remained where it was. Now, Putin has been grumbling about this for weeks and months, and I think it's now clear that he was able to use the Sevastopol incident and his negotiations with Erdogan to put very big pressure on the Europeans and to get the Europeans to unblock the export of Russian grain and fertilizer from European ports. And in fact, we're getting now more and more reports of this fertilizer and of this food being finally able to leave European ports, and apparently it is indeed destined for the global south. So perhaps in terms of the overall conflict, this is a relatively minor affair. It has worked to Putin's advantage. He's again been able to project himself and Russia fighting the global south's corner against the perfidious Europeans who promised to do one thing, then failed to do it, but then are strong-armed by the Russians and the Turks to agree to do what they originally promised. So from Putin's point of view, it's a big win. But of course, in terms of the overall conflict, it is a minor affair. But it does, again, demonstrate the underlying truth that when it comes to this conflict, the only meaningful diplomacy that is taking place is not between Russia and Ukraine. There was quite a lot of negotiations going on in March, but as we all know, that came to an end with Boris Johnson going to Kiev and talking the Ukrainians out of what they'd agreed to, and with the West then committing to basically war without end. So there's been no meaningful negotiations between Russia and Ukraine since then, and the Russians have made clear that they don't expect the Ukrainians to negotiate with them, and that they don't expect any negotiations to take off anytime soon. So, no meaningful negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians, no meaningful negotiations taking place between the Russians and the West. The Americans put up a story about diplomacy. Maybe, as I said, this was never really intended very seriously. It might even possibly have been intended to help the United States a little in the G20 discussions, though I can't really see why that would have been so, or why people at the G20 would have thought that it would be meaningful. But anyway, there was some talk about negotiations, about diplomacy from the United States, but it all seems to have dwindled away. And the only two leaders who are able to talk about this conflict and cut deals with each other are Presidents Putin and Erdogan. This extraordinary couple who have been in almost constant dialogue with each other on multiple international issues, ever since Russia, specifically ever since Russia became involved in Syria back in 2015. They seem to be in almost constant conversation. Apparently they each find the other a rather formidable and difficult interlocutor, but nonetheless they do seem to be able to speak, to talk, to negotiate. Sometimes they argue, sometimes they make up, but generally they're able to move forward and to come to deals with each other. And it's fascinating to compare how frequently Erdogan talks with Putin, with how rarely he talks now to any Western leader. I mean, he barely talks to Biden at all. I don't think he even met with Biden at the G20 meeting, for example. And I don't think that he talks very much to the Europeans, to the Germans or the French or the British or the Italians or anybody there very much either. So Turkey, Russia, they do the deals, and increasingly and interestingly, they don't seem to be about seeking a settlement to the Ukrainian conflict. Erdogan sometimes gives the impression that that's what it is about. But in fact, they talk about Ukraine, but that they ultimately agree to things which are in their direct mutual interest, strengthening the relationship between their own two countries. Just to give one particular example, the grain deal, which we've been talking about, very few people have realized how much Turkey itself benefits from this grain deal. Turkey has one of the biggest milling and flour processing industries in Europe. And in fact, I believe it is the biggest in Europe. And Ukrainian grain goes to Turkey. It keeps the Turkish mill operators busy. They convert it all into flour. Some of it remains in Turkey. Some of it goes to Europe. Some of it now, increasingly, some of it goes to the global south, where, of course, it improves Erdogan's influence as well as Putin's. So Turkey has a direct material interest in this grain deal. The Russians know that. And, of course, the two work with each other. The Turks are able to get Russian exports of food and fertilizer unblocked for them in Europe. The Russians are able to ensure that the Turks get Ukrainian grain, which they can convert into flour. And of course it continues all along the way. They're now busy setting up mechanisms to enable Mercouris to be used in Turkey, bypassing Western sanctions. They're able to develop gas hub ideas, which will position Turkey as the biggest supplier of gas to Europe. And of course, an essential element of the gas hub is that it will bring together gas from Russia, from Azerbaijan, quite plausibly eventually from Qatar as well. So all of this will be mixed up together and sold on to the Europeans, but it will be impossible to distinguish which part of that gas is Russian, which part is from Azerbaijan or Turkmenistan or from Qatar or wherever, making the whole idea of sanctioning any part of this gas traffic is going to become extremely difficult, except of course that Erdogan will be there, Turkey will be there, controlling the tap. And in so many fields, in nuclear technologies, in aircraft production, in all kinds of things, you can see that the Turks have been leveraging their position with the Russians to buy critically important industrial technologies, and the Russians, for their part, have been gradually facilitating Turkey's ever so gentle entry into the Eurasian system. I have to say that if one looks at the geopolitics of this conflict, this is going to be one of the most important developments of all. And if it is followed through to its eventual end point, with perhaps Turkey leaving NATO one day, nobody's talking about it, but it's difficult to see how such an end point can be avoided now if these trends continue the way they are. Well, I'm going to say something. It will be as big a blow for the international position of the United States and the NATO powers, certainly in terms of their influence in the Eastern Mediterranean, as the loss of Eastern Europe was to the Soviet Union and Russia at the end of the Cold War. And it's fascinating to see the careful way it's been done, and the way, as I said, each side seems to be using the Ukrainian conflict. The Russians and the Turks are using the Ukrainian conflict as a vehicle, a mechanism to build their relationship. Not something I anticipated at the start of the war back in February, not something I think anybody anticipated. But it seems to me that at the rate things are going, give it a few more months, perhaps a year, we'll be past the point of no return. Well, that's all I'm going to discuss today in this program. More from me soon. Remember, you can find us on Locals and Rumble and ODYSEE and BitChute and Rockfin and Telegram. And you can also support us via PayPal, sorry, not PayPal, Patreon and Subscribestar, not PayPal at all. Patreon and Subscribestar, you'll find links under this video. And you can also check out our shop, buy yourself the great things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.